Welcome to the panel on secrecy and governance. My thanks to the Technical University of Berlin, who've organized this panel, and I'd like to welcome our colleagues Leon Hempel and Philipp Offermann is covering Philipp's thing, and also Carolina Sachs, who's sitting with us, who've prepared this panel so well. My name is Chris Docksey. I work at the EDPS, the EU Data Protection Authority. This panel today is going to look at how secrecy works and how it can be seen as a legitimate element of governance in democratic societies. I'm the only lawyer on the panel, so it'll be very refreshing. You'll get a different view. I've stolen this expression from Charles Schwab. We will get the other side of the coin, the reality in this panel. But speaking as a lawyer, I'd just like to remind us that the basic problem is that if the state operates in secret and there are no effective controls, then the authorities can, and they certainly will, because it's human nature, take action that will invade our privacy and chill our freedom of speech. So when we're discussing the limits of secrecy in this panel, we should bear in mind three basic principles which we can find developed in the case law of the Court of Human Rights and the Court of Justice over the last 30 years. And for me, the first one is that the rules permitting secret activities which infringe fundamental rights must be laid down in legislation and published in the statute book. Secrecy is unacceptable as a mode for governance, and that was laid down by the Court of Human Rights in the Machon case back in 1984, very appropriate year for that case. Citizens have to know what the state is doing in secret, even if it's to protect them. We obviously don't have to tell people what's being done in specific investigations, but we must know what is being done in secret in our name. And then the second principle is that the rules covering secret activities must lay down specific safeguards to protect our privacy. And there have to be limitations to make sure that what is done is necessary and proportionate. And we've seen a really wonderful slew of case law now in the Court of Justice, the Digital Rights Ireland case in 2014, the Schrems case in 2015, and now the Court of Human Rights 2 weeks ago has said exactly the same again in Szabo and Hungary. And then finally, when we're talking about secrecy, and there was some talk about the clash between the freedom of expression and privacy in the previous panel, but when we're talking about this subject, the protection of privacy is itself an essential safeguard for freedom of expression. If we can be monitored at any time, then it is no reassurance, as one government minister told us recently, that they don't have the resources to monitor us all the time. We will modify what we do and we say. And this was taken into account in the Digital Rights Ireland case in 2015, and they did note that the failure to protect privacy against surveillance could chill freedom of expression. And just a month ago, the Court of Human Rights laid down a brilliant judgment in a case called Zakharov, and they held that you do not have to prove that you're specifically being illegally monitored. It is enough to show that it is possible. So let me now do my job as chair and introduce the members of the panel. And the panel will be led as moderator by Philipp Offermann. I'm replacing him as chair. He's replacing the moderator who had to drop out. Philipp has the most private CV on the CPDP website. And all he will tell us is that he has a background in international relations and visual anthropology. However, I carried out a bit of secret surveillance, and I find that Philipp does work not only at TU Berlin, but at the Center for Technology and Research. And he's working on Fortress, a EU-funded project to develop tools to respond to crises. So Philipp's going to take over in a moment. And the first speaker will be Philipp's colleague at CTS, Dr. Leon Hempel, and he's going to set the context. Leon is the senior researcher on security, risk, and privacy at CTS. He's been working for over a decade on security and surveillance technologies, and so he has a lot of background to stimulate this discussion. And then our three speakers will be looking at three specific questions for discussion. How is the accessibility of the Stasi archives treated by other states and the international community? And this will be discussed by Dagmar Hovestädt. Dagmar is a TV journalist by trade and the spokesperson of the Federal Commissioner for the Stasi records for 4 years. She's lived in and reported on the newly reunified Germany in the 1990s, and so she has the background to have lived these changes. Second question will be, what is the role of whistleblowers in secret services, and how is whistleblowing handled by the affected states? This will be discussed by Machon. Annie was an intelligence officer for MI5 for 6 years in the 1990s, before she left to support a person who was blowing the whistle himself. She is now a writer and a campaigner, and she will be able to share with us her privileged insight into the unpleasant things that happen to whistleblowers. And then finally, Pia Eberhardt will look at the question, how does the secrecy of international negotiation for trade agreements affect statehood in general? Pia is a campaigner with CEO, the Corporate Europe Observatory here in Brussels. CEO is a research and campaign group working on corporate influence and lobbying. And Pia's main area of expertise is EU trade investment policy and the corporate lobbying around it. Philipp, over to you.
Thanks, Chris. Let's make it very brief. We really want to enable a fruitful discussion after the presentation, so we try to keep them very short. Said it in public now again, so I can harass you easier afterwards. Leon, let's start.
Yeah, thanks, Philipp. Thanks, Chris. It's very kind. And indeed, we want rather put on the table, let's say, secrecy in action, or how secrecy works. And then I will try to set the scene by a few considerations. So first, we want to refer to, obviously, the name of the whole conference, thus infrastructures and invisibility. And indeed, infrastructures have or can be characterized by that they tend to become invisible as they are being embedded in the social technical fabric of everyday life. We can experience this on the daily basis. But very interesting is that in SDS and science and technology studies, there's a concept called infrastructural inversion. And this infrastructural inversion, I forgot, it is by Susan Lee Starr and Jeffrey Boker, means that when we are taking care, when we are look at infrastructure, for example, when they fail, then they start to become visible again. And also studying infrastructure exactly means to turn the invisible again to visibility. And I think this is what we try to do also here. But if we look specifically at digital infrastructure, it's becoming immediately clear compared to other infrastructures that the layered architecture, so the social materiality of this specific infrastructure, shows, let's say, practices of invisibilization again. So even if you are turning it around, you are then again confronted with practices of secrecy as a specific mode of governance, and not only for actors as a state, but sure also of corporations, but also of NGOs and even of individuals. So what does that mean? What does that mean that all the different users of these architectures on the different layers they're acting actually somehow also use a kind of secrecy, whatever that means. So looking at the literature, specifically on the, let's say, sociological one very much comes up with a lot of highly interesting pieces, especially from Simmel, for example, who has a certain notion of secrecy, which is a very broad one, and which makes clear, okay, secrecy is something not only limited to one specific actor, but to humankind as such. And in a way that it is a certain form, as he said, a certain social form as such, and it implies a communication. So when I have secrecy, when I have a secret, I communicate it to another person, and then it is a piece of social interaction as such, and indeed it implies an operation which then draws a line between, let's say, the knowledge that is supposed to be secret and the non-knowledge that the other who is not who's not in who does not own this knowledge actually it creates a social order, as I'm saying. So there is an asymmetry based on knowledge and non-knowledge, and the most interesting thing about it is that the secret in terms of content is not even important. It is simply the fact that secret is claimed as such, nevertheless, or independently of what the secret might be. So in the end, what similarly really makes sharp is that to have a secret is a social form which is neutral in the sense of its content. And so it's a simple social form of interaction between humans as such, and therefore this is somehow the basic maybe to try to get an understanding of what is the specific interest different actors gain when they are claiming secrets and when they are using secrecy as a mode of governance. Next, please. Okay, and the interesting point about the question of how is it possible that secrecy again has let's say become a mode in liberal societies of governance can be drawn back on the one hand side in regard to different political theories, but also from the practical point again. So secrecy is an act of signification. We can say, okay, if a knowledge becomes secret, somehow it is maybe more valuable than it was before. And it establishes a knowledge regime between the different parties. And this asymmetry definitely needs to have some legitimation. And from the standpoint of the non-knowledge, to question this asymmetry provokes immediately something like a blame, a kind of blaming. If you want to know, then you put the secret definitely at risk, and especially when from the standpoint of the secret keeper, it is said we are keeping the secret not only for us by ourselves, but for the public, for the society as such. So if you are getting interest in secrets of others, then it immediately can be the case that you are somehow queer in the sense that you have to accept it, but what makes it interesting? Secrecy as time binding. To keep a secret is to control the distribution of claimed knowledge and non-knowledge, and secrecy creates a distinct space within a space based on specific techniques of hiding and internal trust, for example. And the space is not defined, as I said earlier, by its content, but as I would say, by time. Namely, the duration and information is kept secret, and this enables something. This enables a certain control over time and over the knowledge that's kept secret. So secrecy gives something like a temporal advantage, and this makes a particular interest in the sense of how does it become a mode of government. So it's a kind of head start, implying that the time has not yet come to reveal what is hidden. And this time binding, or to claim secret knowledge, and a very famous German historian has worked on that for the secret for secrecy in the 19th century, implies that is to claim that time and history it is at one's disposal compared to the ones who don't have that. So in all the context of the philosophy of history, it's definitely the case. When I know and keep it secret what history will bring, I'm definitely in a kind of temporal advantage compared to those who have not. This time-binding effect makes secrecy attractive, not only as a mode of power, but as a mode of governance. Secrecy is then becoming a promise of security, the advantage of surprise, but also the advantage of surprising the surprise. When we, for example, thinking of certain types of intelligence work, etc., etc. And finally, I want to point out the issue that we definitely problematize secrecy in this idea of transparency. And I think there are a few tensions one has to bring up, even though we know that, for example, we are just in a course of change from secrecy to transparency. When we talk about TTip and all these things, there are things coming up. We can be aware, so there is something about that, definitely. But my question is rather, is this conceptualizing of transparency, is it historical? Is it constitutive? It is constitutive for the self-understanding of liberal societies. The idea is clear of the visible government, and the principle of publicity has been developed in opposition to arcane politics of earlier times. And it has been reintroduced in political thought, as for example, under this term of government house utilitarianism. But to make it clear, is the opposition of transparency and secrecy really the one? Or do we need to understand that this kind of that we need to that this opposition is rather something where we need to say, okay, this is rather something like a continuation, a continuum. On the one hand, the secrecy; on the other hand, the transparency. And finally, my question is whether the opposition need to be also reflected in the sense whether we have secrecy on the one hand and security on the other hand, because if we look at the current discussions about TTIP, or if we look on intelligence failures and the history of intelligence failures, it's immense how strongly secrecy in the end leads to to insecurity and not to security as such. So is there an opposition of secrecy and security is one of my questions, and I would like to close it with a quote from Daniel Ellsberg. I really very much enjoy, and he's more or less saying that secrecy in regard to security raises the issue of being, let's say, or getting rid of the ability to learn, of the ability to hear, of the ability to get feedback, the ability to get criticism, and therefore finally I brought up this very, very nice quote by Daniel Ellsberg, and I don't want to read it at length, but he said, in effect, you will have to manipulate, you'll give up trying to assess what others without clearance have to say. The danger is you'll become something like a moron. You'll become incapable of learning from people in the world, no matter how much experience they have. So secrecy, in the end, creates something like a self-referential system, and therefore, the question is whether this is rather in opposition to security than the other way around. Thanks.
Thank you, Leon. Next one up is Dagmar, and perfectly on time, I might add. I'm very happy.
All right. So I'm sort of a little bit of the odd one out because I do talk about data and documentation that is, to the vast majority, purely analog, and the governing body that manifests this data is been dismantled for 26 years. But I thought, because it's a little odd and different, I'll throw up a slideshow that I'm not going to comment. It's about the history of the Stasi, the Ministry of State Security, of the peaceful revolution, and of our work today in the archive. And I wanted to just support this by 3 sort of theses or thoughts around the history, the current status, and the implications for the topic, the governance by secrecy, and how much that really helps. And so, yeah, just just look at the slides because they change and they give you an inkling of what it used to be like. But I wanted to first introduce who we are, and basically I'm representing an archive, and I don't think there's that many archives that have that history, that is the result of a revolution, the peaceful revolution of 1989 in East Germany, where the people went to the streets and were fessed up with the one-party dictatorship of the Socialist Unity Party of East Germany, and they reclaimed power, and they basically reclaimed the human rights. And one of the results of this peaceful revolution was also that they reclaimed the documents of the Stasi. Stasi is the secret police that has been the most visible and felt and hated instrument of repression, the tool of repression to keep people in line. So I want to first argue that basically the peaceful revolution, if you look at the reclaiming of the Stasi records, is an act of the people to conquer secrecy. You know, because really, why were people so annoyed by the Stasi? Apart from the obvious, it was that for 40 years they had stolen their lives away. They had amassed information on them, files. They had looked into everybody's life as their whimsy and had said, you know, you have the potential to become an enemy of our state. So we start gathering data on you, and you will never know what we do. So there was a tremendous people demand to get into the archives and reclaim that data, reclaim the stolen life, and that is sort of the result of the archive. So here is one of the very few historic processes where we sort of reclaimed secrecy, and it was an experiment when it was actually fought for and achieved that these documents are open to the public for the past 26 years. It's also, I might add in this context here with this audience, had a slight subversive thought that wasn't really on the monitor of many of the people, because there aren't many archives where you can study an intelligence and a service and a secret police in such vast details. There's 40 years of documentation of secret work that you can look in these files. So that's point one. Point two, this is an organization, the Ministry of State Security, that was, we call it the secret police because in the majority of its task, it was tasked with observing their own people. It was there to maintain the power of the Socialist Party for 40 years. And really, it was the most present and felt tool next to the wall. You all know that East and West Germany were separated. There was a wall and a border between the two. And by 1961, the government decided that if you wanted to travel west, you will get shot. So that type of idea does a lot to the psychology of a people. And then on top of that, there is this instrument called the Stasi, or the firm, that is in your everyday life, potentially. You know, I might add that the Stasi was the most powerful where it actually wasn't present, because it was in the heads of people for about, almost 40 years of existence of East Germany. So there is a power in secrecy, in doing something in secret that affects the society at large. And it becomes present whether you want it or not, and it influences how you behave. And it's hard to measure that, but everybody that has lived through these times can attest to that. And so it was important to also, it's important to remember that this was an instrument that it wasn't, even though East Germany called itself the German Democratic Republic, it was really largely there to uphold the power of one party. That was even constitutional, that the constitution and the parliament wouldn't work without that party. In 1969, it was sort of put in the constitution. And that there's a lot to learn from the mechanisms of how that work. But in a way, the Stasi became a constant reminder of the limited access to human rights. It was a society where you could fare well if you were within the party lines. But if you wanted to express yourself in your thought, in your connections with people, if you wanted to form an independent union, if you actually demanded free elections, you became an object of persecution, of repression. And to a vast majority, the thing to really examine even closer is how that could work for 40 years. But in one way or another, it was possible for 40 years to have rigged election, to build a wall and shoot people if they wanted to travel in the wrong direction, to not have a free press, and to persecute you if you just expressed the thought that this government might not be the best form and democracy is not really what the system was about. So the Stasi, and that's another really important point when you want to compare it to today, it acted pretty much undisturbed by any public or parliamentary control or any control whatsoever. it was a free agent in that sense. There were, of course, laws. It was a ministry, there was a bureaucracy, and it was German, so that's why we have a lot of files to document how they worked. But in the party press, they were maybe the 35th anniversary of the Stasi. There was always the great deeds that they did to further the cause of socialism, to keep everybody safe. If you were critical of it, if you wanted to expose anything, not even to speak of whistleblowing or anything, that was clear. You were marked, and you will end up in jail. That was very clear. So, and even in the parliament, there was no control about it. And the Stasi used its power. If you go to the internal understanding of the apparatus, as it was called, it was very much empowering itself, and that's why I think the Stasi as a historic organization is a great case study of what happens if secrecy stays secret. If you can develop secrecy without any interference from public, from exposure or whatnot. So if you look into details, like a quick example, I recently just started reading a few more things also in preparation for here, and I was astounded to find that even in the 80s, the Stasi had access to all kinds of data that in East Germany was protected by the agents that would keep it. So I'm talking about library information, who rents out stuff in the library, insurance information, access to bank accounts. Even it was socialism and planned economy, people had individual lives and individual data. And the Stasi specifically referred in their orders to access this data to upkeep the appearance of secrecy, and that the holders of this data should not know about their access to that data, because they guaranteed their clients or customers or citizens the secrecy of that data. So we can study all these things. We can study the empowering effect secrecy has. We can study what it does to a community, to a state, to a society. And weirdly enough, the Stasi had a different word for secrecy. Of course, they were a Geheimpolizei, a secret police or a secret service. But they were very much keen on the word conspiratorial. That everything had to be conspiratorial. Their meeting conspiratorial. They had an inner conspiratorial behavior within the ministry. You weren't allowed to talk to your colleague about what you were doing, which is not so unusual for as Annie might add, that everything is in code, and the way information is stored is actually not to find it. So to this day, the fact that this archive is accessible is something that's like worse than a nightmare to anybody that worked in the Stasi, because this was their power, their information, and people just claimed it. So in a way, if you really get into the everyday of the thinking of what the Stasi did, it's a great case study for the secrecy that stays secret. And largely a brief point, because we're talking about transparency as well. Our job as an agency has been to balance the transparency of government action, as represented by what the Stasi did and put on paper, versus the protection of the privacy of the citizens that were subject to their activity. In the Stasi Records Act that was specifically written to access this archive, it was decided that the privacy rights of those that worked for the Stasi, and largely their biggest tool of intelligence was human intelligence. They had a vast army of unofficial collaborators, of regular people that conspiratorially worked with the Stasi and delivered information on their fellow citizens. Obviously, technology wasn't that great. There wasn't that many phone calls to tap. All the stuff that the Stasi did as well, postal surveillance, lots of things that happened there. But this vast army of unofficial informants, as well as the staffers of the Stasi, they have to live till today with the fact that you can make their names public and you can discuss their involvement with the dictatorship, whereas the subject of such activity, the victims or their right to privacy is protected. So accessing these files is a tremendous task. We copy and copy and copy, and we redact or blacken out numerous names of third parties to protect the privacy of those. So we have now a vast experience of how complicated it can get to make this information accessible, because at the very start what we didn't want was to spill the secrets in a way that would continue the work of the Stasi. It would continue the defamation of people and the secrecy that was out there. The secret should come out, but it needed to be balanced in a way that it was beneficial to society, and not to continue blaming people, but to understand the mechanisms of a dictatorship and all of that. And the last sentence, in the way, is all about human nature. You know, it's data, it's people, it's secret police, but really it's about how people behave towards each other, how they turn each other into enemies and find all kinds of justifications for doing what is not right. Okay.
Great. Thank you, Dagmar. And, well, Annie's next.
Thank you very much for that. I'm particularly pleased to have the chance to speak straight after Dagmar, because I'm well aware that the Stasi is usually seen as the gold standard, if that's the correct phrase, for what it would be like to live under a police state. And I'm going to be focusing specifically this morning on what it's like in the UK. And from my experiences of working on the inside within MI5, I would suggest that actually what they were doing, investigating people for their political activities from the 50s through to at least the 90s, was pretty much equivalent to what the Stasi was doing, apart from it wasn't quite as invasive on a sort of per capita ratio. But they were involved in using exactly the same techniques and trying to suppress people's legitimate political activity. Now, just picking up on one thing that Leon said initially, the idea of knowledge is power, I think, is fascinating, because then you have to extrapolate and say, well, if you have secret knowledge, is that secret power? I would suggest yes, and I want to explain, particularly from the UK perspective. I worked for MI5, the Domestic Security Service, in the 1990s as an intelligence officer. I was there for 6 years in 3 different postings looking at political subversion, as it was called, Irish terrorism and international terrorism. It was there that I met my former partner, a man called David Shaler, who became a very infamous or very famous whistleblower in the late 1990s for trying to expose a whole range of different spy crimes. By doing this, we ended up literally going on the run around Europe because we faced prosecution. We had to live in hiding for a year. We had to live in exile for another 2 years on top of that in France. And I was arrested, his friends, his family were arrested, activists, journalists, supporters were arrested around us. And of course, David, as the primary whistleblower, went to prison twice for exposing the crimes of the spies. So I have a slightly inside view, should we say, to the process of whistleblowing, and I've been watching with great interest what has happened to Edward Snowden, who I think is probably the only other intelligence whistleblower over the last few decades to have preemptively gone on the run before the story broke in the media. I've been, because of this as well, I've been campaigning over many years to try and put proper regulatory channels in place for people who do have ethical concerns coming out of these agencies to go to, so that they don't have to lose their careers, they don't have to jeopardize their whole way of life, and they don't automatically have to go to prison for trying to expose wrongdoing on the part of out-of-control spies. I've given evidence at the LIBOR Committee in the European Parliament, given evidence to the Investigatory Powers Committee at the UK Parliament, and I've said consistently, we need proper accountability, proper oversight, and a proper meaningful channel for whistleblowers to go to, so they don't have to ruin their lives. And this would lead to greater security as well, because what we see in the intelligence agencies is a very closed environment, where there is groupthink, because there is no ventilation. You are told to just follow orders. If you don't like those orders, then you have to resign. If you do go along with that, it becomes a sort of self-perpetuating oligarchy, where they can slide very rapidly down a dangerous moral path. And this is, I think, what we saw happened over the last 15 years after 9/11, when MI5 and MI6 in the UK became complicit in torture at the behest of the American intelligence agencies. Now, in the 1990s, they wouldn't touch the issue, partly because of ethical reasons, and partly because they knew it was counterproductive. But over the last 15 years, they have indeed been involved in a number of torture allegations. And I think this is partly because if you have a leadership which will not set the correct ethical tone, and then the more junior people are told to just follow those orders, they have no option but to go down that path. We need proper oversight. In the UK, we have 3 key intelligence agencies: MI5, the one I worked for, MI6, the Foreign Intelligence Gathering Agency, and our snooping agency, GCHQ, which is very much like the NSA. Now, these agencies are probably, in the Western world, the most legally unaccountable and legally protected agencies in any notional democracy. I say this because there is no meaningful oversight. Sure, there are laws that have been put in place, only after they existed for 80 years, by the way, in the shadows, and were completely unaccountable. There were laws put in place towards the end of the last century. But in practice, these are toothless. They are meaningless. They also instituted something called the Parliamentary Committee for Intelligence and Security, the ISC, and that came to power in 1994. But ever since then, pretty much, again, it has been toothless. They could not investigate allegations of wrongdoing. They could only look at policy, finance, and administration. Now, they have gained a few more powers over the last 2 years, but they still don't seem to be deploying them adequately in investigating, for example, the illegalities of GCHQ that we now know of because of the revelations of Edward Snowden. The intelligence agencies are also completely exempt from any form of freedom of information. They don't have to give any information away. There is no proper oversight. So, for example, if I wanted to say I want to see my file, as people from former East Germany have the chance to do, I would not be allowed to do that. In fact, one of the disclosures that David and I made was about files held on politicians. And they are notionally governed, they're notionally controlled by the Home Secretary, MI5's political master. Now, at the time, one of the politicians who had had a file held on them was the Home Secretary, Jack Straw. And he said that he wasn't allowed to see his own file, even though he was supposed to be in charge of MI5. In fact, the sheer scale of what MI5 had done over the last half century in investigating their fellow UK citizens for their legitimate political activity was shocking. As I mentioned at the start, the first section I and David worked in was a small section called F2B. Okay. And this was looking at political subversion, as it was called. Basically, they were investigating people for extreme left-wing politics or extreme right-wing politics. However, this broadened out massively. They became very paranoid about Reds under the bed. So throughout the 70s and 80s particularly, they would investigate anyone who might possibly be a query sympathizer or a query member of a subversive group. So you could just be a friend of someone who might be involved in something like the Socialist Workers' Party or the Communist Party, and you too would get a file. In fact, they had files on hundreds of thousands of UK citizens purely for their political beliefs. And files could be made wrongly, of course. There was a very notorious one of a schoolboy who was doing a project on communism, who wrote to the Communist Party headquarters and asked for information about communism. You think that's great, he's showing initiative, he's going to do a really good essay. But because all the letters going there were in those days intercepted, that schoolboy was given a permanent file in MI5. There are also cases of warring couples on the brink of divorce denouncing each other, and then they would both get files in MI5. And this would have real-life implications, because if you were working in certain sectors, such as journalism or politics or any unionized sector, you could be put on a blacklist. It would affect your career for the rest of your life. So I think historically looking at that was a Stasi-like moment. The other issue I mentioned very briefly as well is through this process, MPs were also given files. In fact, up until the general election in 1992, anyone standing as a representative in the UK system was automatically checked ahead of the election to see if they had a record held on them by MI5. If they did, that file was retrieved, and that file was assessed by people like David and me. And we had to write an assessment to say, if this person were elected, if this person were to go into government, would they pose a threat to national security? So our work could actually block the democratic will of the people by blocking certain politicians from certain roles. And I think this is a very significant problem. I mean, in the run-up to the 92 election, we saw a whole slew of files of people who weren't particularly famous then, but then went on to form the Labour government in 1997. So if you think about any politician who'd been in the cabinet of the UK government from 1997 until Labour lost power, pretty much all of those people had MI5 files, and David and I and our colleagues had seen them in 1992. We are talking Tony Blair, Jack Straw, the former Home Secretary, the late Robin Cook, Peter Mandelson, Patricia Hewitt, Harriet Harman, a whole range of different politicians had files held on them. Now, does that mean that they were, in fact, a threat to national security when they were younger? Does that mean, in fact, that they were, they should have been barred from government? No, it doesn't. The fact that they were just involved in student left-wing politics or something was enough to get them those files, and that became a problem. And they knew that they had files held on them. And then they started giving more money and more staff and more resources to the spy agencies. So I think this is a slight problem is an understatement, a slight problem in a modern democracy where spies hold information on people who are notionally their political masters. I think it's very much a case of the tail wagging the dog in the functioning of a healthy democracy. Now, you might say to me, well, this is all history, and it is. MI5 gave up the investigation of subversives in the mid-1990s, and I'm proud to say that I helped that process along. We thought that was the end of it, but unfortunately, the powers were then handed over to a very unaccountable secret section of the police. And this section was not actually governed by the mainstream hierarchy of the police. It actually was hived out to a private company, which is called the Association of Chief Police Officers, who then ran these undercover police, who then infiltrated what they called political extremist groups, starting with animal liberation type groups, but moving on to environmentalists, to any sort of protesting groups. So you have a situation now where full-time coppers are sent in undercover to live as radicals, infiltrate these groups and report back, identify people who, just by going on a demonstration, exercising their legitimate right to protest, will again be identified and have files held on them. And this goes on to this day. In terms of what a police state looks like, I think Britain is getting very close, particularly with the dragnet electronic surveillance, which they are also engaging in illegally and prostituting their freedom of operation to their American masters. So I think just to conclude, I would suggest that Britain is, behind the scenes, sliding towards a sort of police state. We have no means of validating that, though, because it is one of the most secretive states in the Western world. Everyone thinks it's a wonderful modern democracy, but functionally, the powers of the spies and the powers of the police behind the scenes are massive. So to conclude, I would suggest, if you want a healthy, functioning democracy, in Britain certainly, we need to move away from this idea that people can be spied on, but the organisations are completely above the law, completely unaccountable, and move towards transparency for government and also privacy for the individual citizen. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Annie. And now Pia will have the last presentation for today.
Yes, thank you very much. Can you put up the slides? So as we're talking about secrecy in action, I'm talking about secrecy in action in the negotiations for the proposed EU-US trade deal, the so-called TTip. And I would like to make 3 points. First, the negotiations are shrouded in secrecy. Second, this secrecy helped spark, ironically or not, the anti-TTIP movement. And the third point is that the Commission is trying to silence the movement with its so-called transparency initiative. And I have to wait for the slides because otherwise you won't see the pictures I will be talking about and the quotes.
Sorry.
No problem.
Transparency Initiative ein Wort zu sprechen? In der Zwischenzeit oder das kommt später?
What do you mean?
Can you say something about transparency?
I will talk about it in the so these are the 3 points I
going
want
to come up.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry for that. I can see the slides, so but voila.
points.
So these are the 3 points I would like to make. The first one is about the negotiations being shrouded in secrecy. Next slide. And just to give you an idea of the amount of information that is hidden from the public in these negotiations, here's an excerpt from a letter of the EU's chief negotiator for these negotiations to the counterpart in the US, from right the moment when the negotiations started in summer 2013, where the Commission ensures the US that all documents related to the negotiation or development of the TTip agreement, including negotiation texts, proposals of each side, accompanying explanatory material, discussion papers, emails related to the substance of the negotiations, and other information exchanged in the context of the negotiations will be held in confidence. The Commission may decide to make public certain documents that will reflect exclusively the EU position, and I will come back to that later. So what we are confronted with is negotiations where, in particular, the most significant information for people to be able to say, is TTIP good or bad, is withheld from the public, and that is the actual negotiation text. So if you wish, the draft law, which you can see in any other legislative process. But this is withheld in the negotiations, and that will remain the case until the end of the talks. Governments and parliaments, so the governments of the EU member states and the members of the European Parliament and national parliaments can see these texts, but only in special reading rooms. That is different from the EU's previous negotiations, where, for example, our ministers of economics were sent draft negotiation text via email or on paper, which makes it possible that you, for example, discuss them with a colleague in your office or with an expert. You might not have expertise on 1,500 pages of documents. The US demands are revealed to no one but the European Commission, so parliamentarians and government officials cannot see them. So this means that the public scrutiny and robust review of this agreement through journalists, through interested people, through experts in academia, for example, who might know about certain issues, is basically made impossible. I'm not sure if this can be seen in the back. This is just excerpts from the rules that apply to the reading rooms that are set up in EU capitals so that government officials can go there. These reading rooms are in the US embassies. And just to give you an idea of what it means to go to a reading room. So you can go there during 2 days per week by appointment only. The German government had to provide a list of around 120 government officials that were able to access these rooms, and it's only if you're on that list that you can go there. Appointments will be limited to 2 hours. There will be US embassy personnel in the room. You sign, obviously, the obligation to not disclose anything you see, so to not talk about what you see. So that is also a rule that applies for members of the European Parliament who go to these reading rooms here in Brussels. You are allowed to bring a pen, no cameras, no other recording devices, obviously no computers, and then you have a very long list. So these are the rules for the reading rooms, to give you an idea. These are the kind of documents relating to negotiations. So that is not negotiation texts, but this in particular is a minute of a meeting between European Commission negotiators and lobby groups. In that case, it was the Recording Industry Association of America, very early when the negotiations were prepared. We asked for these documents for our research via the EU's Access to Information law, which is pretty good, but not good enough to prevent this, or also the next document where you can see not releasable. So obviously, the Access to Information law has a number of exceptions. It should protect the privacy of certain individuals, but should also protect, and this is the exception that the EU usually uses in censoring these documents, it should protect the EU's international relations and internal decision making. And this is the key exceptions that they use to blacken out certain parts of documents, saying, this will endanger our relations with the US, what we discussed here with the lobby groups about TTIP, and it will make our own internal decision-making processes impossible. And very often what is deleted is discussions about negotiation strategy with the people in the room, which is very often business groups. So that was my first point, this negotiations being shrouded in secrecy. Secondly, this secrecy helped spark the anti-TTip movement. This is not just the case for TTip, it's a key element of controversies about trade negotiations in all parts of the world because they're all held in secrecy. So here you see a little protest action by the Council of Canadians protesting about the secret negotiations of the now concluded Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, the TPP. This is an image of members of the European Parliament, mostly the left group, the Greens, and some individuals, righteous socialists, I would say, social democrats, protesting in front of the reading room in the European Parliament, because at that time it was only open to certain MEPs, not to all, and they're also protesting against, being treated like spies, basically, by having to sign all these papers that they're not allowed to talk as elected officials with their constituents about what they see. And this is another nice example of how you can see campaign groups also use the secrecy in the negotiations. An infographic by the campaign group Some of Us, where they describe the reading room. It's actually quite funny. So the first question is, are you an MEP? No, no access. Are you in Brussels? No, better call the travel agent. Have you filed an application? It will take time, etc. And when you've made it through this maze as an MEP in this situation, there's congratulations. You may now skim hundreds of pages of TTIP documents in 1 hour in a language that you are not fluent in, and you can't tell anyone about it afterwards. This is, I wanted to show this to you because it's the documents that were most accessed on our website last year. It's the most accessed publication, the text we wrote about those, which also gives you an idea about how these kinds of censored document secrecy creates interest and inspires a movement. In that case, it's a letter that British American Tobacco sent to the European Commission about its interest in all kinds of ongoing trade negotiations. And the fact that there was so much interest also tells you or already indicates that we might be able to create less interests for documents that are maybe equally important for the public interest, but not censored, but published by the European Commission. So this is a challenge that I'm confronting at the moment, for example, where you might have heard the most controversial issue in these negotiations is about foreign investor rights. There was a 2-year pause in this issue because of the controversy. Now the European Commission has proposed a proposal. It will be negotiated for the first time in a few weeks in Brussels. And I get zero interest from journalists because it's not a leak that I can provide them with. It's a public document, but it's horribly dangerous. They need to look at it, but they don't. So this was just to, show you about how secrecy then helps create a movement and interest. And maybe relates also to the point that you made in the beginning that the margins between secrecy and transparency are actually more fluent than we might think. Lastly, the Commission is now trying to react to this movement that was created with a so-called transparency initiative. You might have heard about it. It's a big fuss that the Commission made. It's the most transparent trade negotiations we've had ever. And it's true, but it only tells you something about how dark, how middle-aged negotiations happened before. So what changed really? It's not so much. It's not nothing, but we have to put it in perspective. So what we have now is that most, not all, but most of the EU's positions papers, so the position with which it goes into the negotiations, are published on the website, and that more parliamentarians than in the past get access to the draft chapters, which is called the consolidated texts, in reading rooms. So that's not nothing, but to just go back to the initial point, the main problems remain. We don't see the negotiation texts. We have the reading rooms. Governments and parliamentarians are not allowed to talk and discuss and create a democratic debate about what they see. US demands not revealed, etc. So the problems remain. This is my last slide. What are the effects of secrecy? also to come back up to the question, what does it mean for statehood? And I would say, yes, I mean, while it did help spark attention and resistance, I think the overall effects of the secrecy in the negotiations are negative, and for two reasons. This will be hundreds and thousands of pages of text that will be, if it ever gets ratified, in place forever, realistically. And this agreement has impacts on the food we eat, the safety of our data, the services that are provided by our city. So it really has an impact on people's lives. And it is extremely dangerous to negotiate such an agreement with a very closed shop of people. Because even if they mean well, they make mistakes. So this also maybe refers to your point, Annie, about what it means, when you keep so much power in the hand of a few people. And we could see that in previous negotiations, that when texts were leaked, people spotted problems and they were then changed. And the second problem is, I think, that it really tilts the balance of power in society further towards those who already have quite a bit of power. In government, that is clearly the executive, as opposed to elected bodies. And in civil society, it is not only, but largely big business. So people who have a lot of resources are well connected and have their way to get to this information despite the secrecy. And coincidentally or not, TTip will, as an agreement and its contents, will mean a power transfer exactly to those actors, from parliaments to the executive and from other citizens to big business. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Pia. I think there are numerous interesting things we can kind of talk about after those 4 presentations. I was especially intrigued of what you said last, that documents that are published regularly and not touched by any censor are much more interesting, and it's not even important what's in there. Just the fact that they have been kind of leaked makes them important. This connects very nicely to what Leon said earlier about the secret as a fact of its own, independent from content. So I'd like to give you the opportunity to remark on some of the, if you have some remarks on some of the other talks or some summary points, and then I would like to give the word to the floor. We have about 15 to 20 minutes left until they shove us out with that bell.
I wanted to just add a little today's news to Pia's story, because the United States is threatening the German legislators who go to the reading room with denied access if they leak any of that information they read in that reading room to the public. So that's sort of the big investigative story today breaking in Germany. So that whole idea, is there. And even though I'm sort of here talking from a time way back when, the Stasi had a reading room too, because they didn't trust their own people to take information out of the archive, and when they needed to read up on old files, they had to do that in a reading room that was under supervision. So to me, just putting all of this next to each other with all the differences, my job is always, or the way I understand it, is that we have this vast resource of history where we can see where things went utterly wrong. And if we are in a democracy and we really take ourselves seriously in our desire for human rights, for accountability, for the rule of law, and for all these things, here we have a big history that we all agree was wrong. So how come we're repeating these mistakes and we are not really taking ourselves seriously enough? And so, Pia's is a great example of those that are in the know will always stay in the know, and will increase the mechanisms to keep the rest out.
Can I just pick up on that point as well? That there has been an inquiry in the Bundestag in Germany into the BND's collusion with the NSA and GCHQ and all the rest of it, illegal spying on Germans. And in this inquiry too, they've got the same sort of structures in place, where only certain chosen MPs are allowed into a reading room. They can't take notes. They have very little time to absorb the information, and then they're expected to go out and really grill the spies about what they've got up to. Just one final point as well, listening to the TTip talk was absolutely fascinating. I have been following it a little myself, because I always go back to Benito Mussolini's definition of fascism, you know, the Italian Second World War dictator. And he always said it was the merger of the corporate and the state. And I think this is precisely what we're seeing with TTIP. The corporations are actually not merging, they're taking over the state, actually, it's worse.
So, anyone from the audience with a comment on this, on a single presentation? Or maybe, over there in the back? Thanks.
Thank you. I would like to make a comment on the question of archives, secrecy, and transparency in recent history context, and perhaps putting it more into the context of the main focus of CPDP. The example of the Stasi archives, it's a great example. You did a great job in separating, in drawing the borderline between the personal information, personal data, which must be made public, which must be made transparent. I mean, people who were henchmen, who were dictators, who fulfilled the public functions, and the vast majority of the people who were spied on. But there exist other types of recent history archives, not only in former dictatorships, but everywhere. And these archives are led mostly by historians or archivists. And they have different ideas about transparency, and that's, in some cases, historians, for example, there's a temptation to think that they represent a special caste in society. They have a noble task to open up the wrongdoings of regimes and past regimes, and the individual people whose lives are documented in the papers, in the files, are just the raw material of their task. And everything should be open to the public. This is a great temptation. And I just would like to call the attention to the present and future archivists, especially communism and Cold War archivists, or human rights archivists who are interested in great violations of human rights, not in human rights as such, to draw a clear borderline between the, I wouldn't call it secret, protected information and transparent information. And in most cases, I'm afraid, they are not prepared for that. Stasi is a good example, but it was relatively easy to define the borderline because it's history. But the other types of archives are just yesterday's papers.
Thank you. I just wanted to add that the Germans were particularly sensitive to these issues of data protection, not to last because there had been a dictatorship before, and there had been in the 80s a big push to establish the right for informational self-determination in the German constitution. So it was watched with very much distrust to make this information available. So it is a Data Protection Act and a Freedom of Information Act in one, the Stasi Records Archive Access Law. And you're absolutely right. It all is possible because the country that this secret organization was working in disappeared. You know, that makes a big difference. You can't just open up the files for current intelligence services. Yeah.
That's some intrusion as well. Leon.
Yeah, I would like to pose another question to Annie, because I'm particularly interested in, let's say, the creation of the whistleblower. So who's creating it, and what is creating it? So is it more or less moral sensitivity, people have, or do they become, let's say, morally affected by what they are doing? So, or does it mean when I'm working within an organization that is working on or based on secrecy, is the fact that secrecy makes me something like being special, like being, owning something, a kind of knowledge others do not have? So it is somehow making myself a kind of subject, right? So I'm becoming a subject in the sense of I'm getting, if I'm working on the basis of secrets, then I'm really getting something like an individual. So is this can you follow on that, or can you make a few remarks? Because I would even say, is Snowden someone who is specifically a moral person from its own, or was he made by the NSA?
I think there's a very interesting couple of questions. My personal view is that a lot of very good people do end up being recruited by the intelligence agencies. They don't want to be evil Stasi officers or anything. They go in usually because they want to protect their country, protect their fellow citizens. They feel it's a job that could make potentially a huge difference, potentially stop bombs going off. When I was recruited, the intelligence agencies had a filthy reputation from earlier whistleblowers and abuse of rights, so I wasn't terribly keen. But the very long and very intense recruitment process reassured me they had to obey the law, and that they were looking for a new generation of intelligence officers to investigate terrorism. So it sounded like eventually a good job. My ethical position then, which I was very open about, has not changed till now. We don't get involved in torture. We don't intern people without trial. You don't shoot to kill. And they still recruited me. They thought they wanted people like that. So I think that people who then end up blowing the whistle have argued all these sort of positions from the inside for years. And the frustration that they are told to just shut up and follow orders, the frustration with the groupthink means that certain people who can will take that risk and go public to try and effect pressure from the outside to reform on the inside. In terms of the secrecy and what it does to you as a person, it's a very strange process where even during the recruitment, it's like a pane of glass comes down between you and the rest of the world, where you can't tell even your friends, perhaps your very close family, but you can't tell most people you are being recruited by these agencies. So suddenly, the friendship becomes slightly bogus. You can't be fully explicit, fully open. And friendships suffer, for example. And then when you start working there, you're suddenly immediately swamped with all this very secret information, like people's private conversations, people's private emails. And that feels intensely intrusive and intensely strange for probably about 3 weeks. And then it just becomes a normal in-tray. And that's a really strange feeling to go through as well. And when you see that highly invasive work being abused or used to abuse your fellow citizens, that's when you really have to start questioning and start raising your concerns and start trying to effect a difference from the inside. The trouble is there's such resistance to this sort of change that that's why people do come out and go public.
Okay, so now we're reminded we're really late, and I'd like to turn the mic over to Chris for some closing remarks.
Well, I said we'd be hearing the other side of the coin. I've just been overwhelmed by this has just been fascinating. And I said I thought there were 3 basic points, but in fact, both Dagmar and Annie reminded me that there's a 4th basic point. They both talked about the complete lack of public party or parliamentary control in Germany, the lack of an ethos within the intelligence agency in the United Kingdom, the lack of even effective political control by people in power. And so maybe I could just make this last remark that the 4th thing that I forgot to mention was the need for effective supervision and control. In our parliamentary processes, even the culture inside the organizations. Annie, you mentioned the question of ethos at the top. The European Ombudsman has said to all the European institutions that we have to adopt rules, which we have done, on whistleblowing to provide structures so that people don't have to go public, don't have to menace their careers. There is a structure which is encouraged inside to absorb that. And as well as that, we have a structure across Europe of bodies which are responsible in part for monitoring the work of even secret agencies. And I just picked it up this morning, so I haven't read it yet. I've only just, but it's a report by the FRA, and I recommend you to look at it. It turns out, looking at the blurb on the back, that there are some data protection authorities which can look at the privacy aspects of these, but not all. And I say it's a very basic point that unless people who are working in these departments know that they are going to be regularly scrutinized and will have to justify what they do, and that's why surveillance of the surveillors is important, then it is just, and I go back to your point at the beginning, Leon, we're talking about human nature. It's nice to have a secret. It makes you feel important. So thank you very much to our moderator, and thank you very much to our panelists. Thank you.
Yeah, and to you, of course.